Do you feel like we're coming back to God?
I think that there is a God-shaped hole in people's heart that has to be filled somehow, and either it's going to be filled with addictions and politics and tribal thinking, or it's going to be filled with God again. And so I think that people increasingly...
I think we're looking at the hand of Nineveh again.
Yeah,
I think our people need to repent and beg God to come back to this country.
I mean, I agree with that, actually. I think it's deeply important that people go back to church.
If this isn't the actual most cliche argument for the necessity of God or the obviousness of God, then I don't know what is. I would be surprised if even one of you watching has not heard about the God-shaped hole. And so today, my goal is to crush this once and for all. Let's jump into point 1 of tackling this. And I'm not even sure what to call it again. Maybe an argument, but it's not an argument. That is actually point 1. It's a marketing slogan. This phrase is not evidence for God. This is a poetic metaphor. It sounds emotionally appealing. Again, why it mattered to me when I was young and heard it. But it offers no data, no logic, not even any explanatory power behind it. It's like saying there's a Zeus-shaped hole or a horoscope-shaped hole. You're just asserting the conclusion you already want to reach. And yet these people talk about it like it's some great discovery of mankind, that what we're really missing is God. But it's not a discovery at all. It's a diagnosis that already assumes that God is A, real, and B, needed. Which leads me to point 2, which is that this is a false dichotomy, a fallacy. That we can either only have God, or Shapiro gives us 3 examples. They were addictions, policy, or tribalism, which is hilarious coming from him. That's an absurdly limited list. And notice that they're all negative because, of course, they're trying to separate God, what is good, from everything else that is bad. What about all the good things one might fill their God-shaped hole with? What about love, art, music, philosophy, science, nature, human connection? The list is on and on and on. So to say that it's either God or only destructive behavior, again, false dichotomy, not real, not fair to be utilized in this way. And furthermore, it's insulting to the millions of non-believers that are living flourishing lives, and honestly, probably billions, right? Because they are making the case, which this is a later point, that the God-shaped hole is Yahweh. But there are believers in other gods who their life and their societies are going fine for them. It's weirdly elitist and pretty darn tribal thinking, which is really, again, hypocritical for what is being said. Also, maybe I should give you the context of how this conversation sets up a little bit. It's on, of course, how America has lost its way, the penalties for that, what it was like when Shapiro was growing up and people still picked up their trash. That was like a big piece of it.
When I was growing up, it was like, okay, if there was a piece of trash on the street, you pick it up. Trash everywhere. Okay, so there's trash on the street. Well, isn't there a trash person whose job it is to like come and pick up the trash? If there's trash on the street, so if you see something in there and the trash guy missed it, probably you should pick it up and just toss it in the trash.
Shapiro went on more about the duty of picking up trash and what that looks like for a society and how it was different back when, I guess, people believed in God than he did even this God-shaped hole segment. Thus why Jenko's doing his Nineveh thing, right? Because, again, it's about a great nation that turns wicked and needs to repent before they're destroyed. But that's all beside the point. Let's get back on track to our third point. And I think that this one is especially gross because it pathologizes natural human longing. Everyone experiences longing and uncertainty and a search for meaning. But how unfair for you to take these existential questions, for lack of a better term, and turn them into symptoms of divine absence in someone's life. It's like saying that being hungry is evidence of a divine sandwich hole in my stomach that I keep trying to fill with all these other foods when only the divine sandwich will do. No, people get hungry because that's part of the human experience. People have longing and desire because that's part of the human experience. Just because one is more abstract or esoteric does not mean that it equals God immediately. And again, this plays and preys off of people that are in more need. There are many people that do feel whole, that have gone through periods of longing, but again, they filled it with other things like meaningful relationships, and now they're content. So you have 2 issues now, because you either have to tell that person who is content, you're not really content. You're being tricked by the things you've filled that hole with. But then on the other hand, you will often tell people that they can't fill that hole, that nothing can actually be meaningful to them if it's not divine or from God. Well, which is it? Longing itself does not prove that a specific object must exist to satisfy it. That just does not follow. And that is actually an argument. That is from C.S. Lewis himself, that because we long for God, God must exist, but because we long is all we know. It is believers who fill that gap with God and then use it to prove him and then to turn it around on us. I long for a lot of things: eternal youth, the ability to fly, my children to grow more slowly, but desire does not equal reality. Let's move on to point 4, though, which I already alluded to. Which God fills the hole? If there is indeed a God-shaped hole at all, how come it's filled with so many different thousands of gods? Over the course of human history, of course. It's funny because this is always typically projected at non-believers as what we're missing, or it's used again to shame current believers that they are on the path toward destruction. But it's never used in a debate between a Christian and a Muslim or a Hindu, because religious pluralism destroys this argument. Clearly, this supposed hole is quite pliable, bending to whatever belief system a person was born into. So again, if the hole can be filled with anything, or specifically any kind of God or name of God or God belief or religion, then it proves nothing about what the hole was shaped like to begin with. Also, while I'm promoting my videos, see my reverse teleological argument, and in a similar fashion, we can kind of move into number 5. It's confession of a design failure by this God, if this is indeed what he created. Think about it. If an all-knowing, all-loving God created people with a hole that causes them to spiral into addiction, nihilism, or tribalism, without him, that's not love and that's not a good design. In fact, it would look something more like emotional blackmail. Now again, parents don't have this ability, but can you imagine if I did have this ability and I chose to create my children with this desperation to please me, to belong to me, to commune with me, or else they suffer and suffer immensely? I'd be a monster. Of course I would. So then of course this God is, if he were real. And I've been teasing this video for a long time, but I do have a video coming up finally. I've almost finished writing my list out, where we are going to cover so many reasons, so many differences between a good human parent that lacks omniscience, omnipotence, perfection, and that version of the God of the universe. It's beyond telling, I think. But let's move on to number 6, which is kind of the data points behind all of this, the empirical evidence that says this isn't true. If not having your God-shaped hole filled with the correct and proper God means that you will inevitably be filling it with these horrible and destructive things, then why are atheists and agnostics constantly, like by an insane margin, represented to be the least likely to be incarcerated, right? All these Christians in the American prison system that make up the vast majority of those populations, they supposedly have the right God in their heart. So why did they turn to theft or murder or abuse? Aren't those things evidence of that God-shaped hole? That doesn't make any sense. And who would have a bigger God-shaped hole than the actual atheist? And you know what? Sometimes I can hear Christian arguments forming in my head from my past and in expectation of what will happen in the comments. So let me get ahead of this, because I was just going to say, look at me. I'm not filling my God-shaped hole with anything that Ben talks about. But I can hear the Christians saying, yes, you are. Look, you have an entire channel dedicated to railing against this God. This is one of the most cliche comments that I get. You sure talk about God a lot for someone that doesn't believe in him. But I'll say now, because somehow the vast majority of Christians posting don't seem to understand this concept. I don't believe in God. I don't hate God. I'm not fighting God. I'm not making a channel to destroy God. But religion is real. The effects of it are real. The harms of it are real. The overreach of it into politics and affecting the country I live in are real. Discussing that and wanting to help others who are going through the journey I have gone through and know how difficult it is has literally nothing to do with the false God I don't believe in. Just the religion built around the idea of him. But getting back to the point, and I know that this has been talked to death, but highly agnostic and atheistic countries like Sweden, Norway, and Japan do not just descend into chaos and madness, as Ben and George would have us believe is what is happening to us and why it's happening. In fact, they outperform religious countries on almost every measure of well-being. If a God-shaped hole inevitably leads to these horrific things that are damaging to the structure of society and the individual self, then why, when we look at the lives of the individuals and the societies that are built with them, do we not see that? My next point is that I think that when this is used, it is often just projection. Now, this may not be the case for Ben, but there's two sides to the projection coin. The first one is that there are many people who have been longing, and then they find God or they convert, and that longing goes away. And so they project that onto everyone else. Hey, all of you who are broken like me, who were addicted to something like me, who struggled with this sin like I did. And that's because you have a God-shaped hole in your heart and you keep trying to fill it, but you got to fill it with God like I did. And for some people that works, and that's great. But 2 years later, when they realize it was all a facade and they walk away, does the argument get retracted? No, it's still out there. And if you try to point out that, hey, they're still longing and this thing wasn't a fix for them, then the Christian says, oh, they were never really a real Christian to begin with. It was just an illusion that they were fixed for a moment, probably by the devil, because they were in the wrong denomination of Christianity or whatever the stupid thing's going to be. So in general, when people say this, I think half of the time, or at least one of two potential projection options here, is that it happened to work for them, at least at that moment, and so they're spreading that idea. And then I think the other half are people like Ben, who maybe were always raised this way, so they didn't have that dramatic conversion moment, but they've had a privileged life where they feel connected. They feel like their existential questions are answered. They don't fear death. They have a sense of belonging and community because these are some of the things that religion can do for us. And they look at the honest atheist or agnostic saying, I don't know, like it's some unacceptable answer. And they say, see, you're not whole like I am because you don't have God like I do. Either way, it's projection. And then my last point then is just to try to point out the truth of this, that real fulfillment doesn't require fantasy. And if you think you're fulfilled because of fantasy, it's a good patch. It might work for a while. It might even work for your entire life, but that doesn't mean it was true or necessary. Like it or not, believers, humans can and have built meaning and purpose without imaginary gods. There's a lot of beauty, maybe more beauty, in knowing you can create your own meaning instead of being assigned it. People thrive through compassion, curiosity, courage, and creativity, to be cliche with all the C's. I feel like a pastor sometimes. And no, these are not lesser replacements for God. They're human strengths that I actually think work a lot better when the false idea of God gets out of the way. Not everything has to be God-given. Not everything has to be objective. Not everything has to be known in order for you to still live a good life. And anyone who is telling you differently is evangelizing and nothing more. They have no greater grasp on truth than you do. And it would be one thing if this were just simply untrue, but it's not just untrue, this claim that Ben is making. It's incredibly unaware and hypocritical of how many Christians still have longing. They're not getting it met by God. And yes, I know that's the tension of the point, that he's saying, well, even the Christians that don't, it's because they are filling what should be God in their life with these other things. But again, for all the reasons we just said, that's missing the point. Maybe if you have to keep telling people that believe in the thing you already want them to believe in, that the reason they still have issues in their life or the reason their country is falling away is because they're not actually believe in that thing, or they're not actually living correctly as if they do, or that they're not actually Christians in the first place. Maybe if you have to keep moving that goalpost, it's because the game is rigged. So that's the main chunk of the video, but I'm going to show you a couple more things that Ben says here that I do want to address. Leaving the short and going back to the actual interview, here's what comes next.
I do think that it's very important that people, get enmeshed in a biblical set of values again. Because that undergirds all the principles that I want to see. So the things that we used to hold in common when I was growing up, things like you are an individual and I should treat you by your individual nature and how you act rather than your race, right? Like that is a biblical principle, right? That's human beings are made in the image of God,
Amen.
Right? In male and female, he made them, right? Mm-hmm. This is straight from Genesis. So that's a straight biblical principle, but it's very hard to get there actually through and be non-tribal without that verse. Like I think that's the most important verse in all the Bible.
I'm so blown away that these words were able to come out of his mouth, because we have the rest of the Old Testament telling us quite a different story. And again, I'm only talking about the Old Testament here because we're talking about Ben Shapiro. What is the story of the Old Testament if not straight up tribalism? When God, when not even pressed or asked, literally gives permission for his chosen people. Sorry, you can't even have a term like chosen people and then get on your high horse to talk about how tribalism happens in lieu of a god. No, it is happening because of this god. The hypocrisy is overwhelming. But yeah, you cannot have that god saying, go and purchase and own slaves from only the nations around you, not within you, and keep them as property for life and pass them down as inheritance. You don't get to have that. And talk about how it's because of biblical principles that we should know we can see each other as individuals and not by race. What utter nonsense. And it's not just Leviticus 25:44 through 46 that makes that problematic. It's every genocide that the chosen people commit. It is all the favor and divine intervention against free will of their enemies that the chosen people get. Even within the chosen people, you had 12 tribes. Only one can be priests. How is that not tribalism? Or what about within the sexes? Women had so much less value and so much more inbuilt harm on them from this wonderful creator of the universe that clearly put that there is no tribalism and it's all about the importance of respecting the individual. Like, no, you don't get to do that. Just read your Bibles. But then he goes on to make another point. So let's see this.
How about the idea that we have to reason together? Reason is really, really important. Well, obviously that's deeply important in Christian literature. I mean, that's the logos, right? But in Jewish thought, that's also the idea behind there's a creator. He made a discernible, understandable creation, right? Lo b'shamayim, he is the quote in Hebrew. It's not in heaven, right? It's given to you so you can understand it, right? So using reason is actually a biblical value. Mm-hmm. And when you don't have reason, then you just revert back to the feelings. You revert back to how I feel about things and what makes me feel good. And that's really dangerous.
Over and over and over, I read in a Bible that to lean on our own understanding is wrong. That faith is belief in what we cannot see and assurance of things hoped for. The assurance of things hoped for is the opposite of reason. Blindly believing in a God despite horrific evidence is not reason. Telling people when they are trying to be reasoned and they see issues with this God concept and the religion, that there's an invisible enemy, that an all-powerful, all-just God gave dominion over the world, that has the divine property still to be able to influence our hearts, read our minds, infiltrate our minds, these kinds of things, that's the actual thing that is happening when people try to utilize reason is not reason. It's invoking the imaginary over and over and over to control. So he's kind of doing his Ben Shapiro thing, right? Where he talks about facts don't care about your feelings. Do I need to spell out here that his entire first argument that we just got done tackling is all about the feels, the longing, the craving, the God-shaped hole in your heart? I thought it was about facts, but I'm the one over here talking about the facts of how people can find fulfillment and meaning without God, how people can live productive and useful lives without God, and that often people who believe in God have a harder time or a worse society when doing so. But let's go to the third and final point here, I think.
The idea that you have duties in the world, like moral duties in the world, to your wife, to your children, to your community, to your country, right? As opposed to a country that is rooted in what am I owed, right? What are the things that everyone else owes to me? So when I was growing up, it was like, okay, if there's a piece of trash on the street, you pick it up.
Okay, so this is when he gets into the whole piece of trash thing, and we don't need to go down that rabbit hole with him. We've heard enough here on this third point that there's moral duties that we owe our family. Well, unless what, though? Unless there's a higher moral duty of what we owe God, right? The greatest command is to love God, then to love your neighbor. Jesus and Paul weren't big on promoting family, actually. In fact, it was Jesus who said, you need to be ready to hate your family. Why? Because there's a higher allegiance to God. Even if that's hyperbolic language, it's still setting up a hierarchy. And when you have some moral duties that, yes, especially in the Old Testament, you can see, but first of all, those moral duties are tribalistic. Taking care of the poor and the widowed, the different kinds of tithes that were set up, that was to take care of the in-group. So it's already hilarious, again, how much we're going back on the hypocrisy of the first statement that tribalism comes from the God-shaped hole. No, once again, it is the recognition of the belief in God and the text that belongs to him that creates a lot of that tribalism. And then again, going back to the hierarchy there, anytime that you have this greater thing over all other moral duties, divine command, it actually minimizes the reality of those moral duties. I too believe in moral duties. I don't believe they're objective. I believe they're useful. And I actually like a lot of what he goes on to say about how just pick up the trash. Who cares if you already pay a tax service for trash men? It's still your community. Improve it. But the only thing I can think that actually erases that faster than just people's inherent selfishness is the idea that they're special, that they're set apart, that they owe their allegiance not to their community, not to their fellow person, that they don't have to be equal with how they treat people because their book says something else, because their God in their feelings has put something on their heart that they should be doing that's more important instead. Like, again, I think there's a reason that God belief typically has some of these negative consequences that are exactly the opposite of what Ben is trying to espouse here. And it is the great excuse, the great exception. It's the exact same thing that people run into when they're trying to make the objective moral argument. They say that it's always wrong to murder. You point out the times God murders or commands murder, and they say, well, that's different because it's coming from God. The great excuse, the great exception. You don't get to do that in normal society. But with God, all things are possible, mainly being hypocrisy. And no, I am not at all trying to make the case that every society that doesn't have God or every individual that doesn't believe in God is better and perfect. No, we're still human. Humans still are selfish. We still mess up. We still do stupid things. But when you can justify those stupid, selfish, harmful things as good and giving and loving and wise, that's the real danger. So I'll stop there. Honestly, this video is 1 hour and 24 minutes, and I would love to go through it all. If you'd like to see that, if you want a big old 2.5 hour episode, let me know. I'll see you Thursday with another Thinking Thursday episode. And until then, keep thinking. I wanted to personally thank my top tiers of support: my Iconoclast, Ann, Boris, Grant, GVI, Jimmy, Joe, Kitboga, Matthew, Perry, and Shawn; my Humanist heroes, Craig, James, Jarrod, Kristi, and Matthew; my Atheist advocates, Aquitar, Caleb, Dan, David, Drew, Jeff, Jeffrey, Julie, Malcolm, Paul, Sparky, and Thomas; as well as all of my secular scholar patrons. If you believe in the mission of this channel, please consider joining these fine people.